Over these last few weeks, as we've been walking with Jesus, we've seen him feed a crowd of 5,000 men, plus women and children, with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. We've seen him then send the disciples out, and in the middle of the night, as they're battling a storm, he walks out to them on the waves. Peter says, well, if it's you, invite me to come out. Seems kind of odd, but Peter then stepped out of the boat and walked for a bit before getting distracted by the wind sinking and crying out for God to save him. And Jesus reached down immediately and lifted him up. As we gather here in this space too, we are reminded how God feeds us, how God provides for our needs of body and life. And how God also continues to walk with us and to meet us in the middle of the storms of this life, especially those storms that can be very frightening for us. But this week we experience a little bit of a different view of Jesus. Every time I read this section of Matthew's biography of Jesus, I'm struck going, this is not the Jesus that I've come to know and love, at least not till the end of the story. But leading up to this, Jesus first is with the Pharisees, with the legal experts. And they're doing what they always do with Jesus. They are going round and round and round about the rules, about the law. They said, Jesus, your disciples don't do the ritual hand washing before they eat. Why don't they do that? You know, well, as I've gone through this world, I've figured there are about 3 kinds of people. There are people that enjoy the rules, embrace the rules. And they follow the rules, and they want everybody else to follow those rules. And sometimes they're very helpful in helping other people follow the rules. Then there are the people that go, it's okay to bend a rule here and there. What harm is it going to do? And then there's the people who say, the rules don't apply to me. The Pharisees are a mix of the last 2. As they have these ways of getting around the spirit of God's law, they find creative ways to keep the letter of the law, but they violate the spirit of what the law says. And so as Jesus speaks to the Pharisees, he says, listen and understand, it's not what goes into the mouth that contaminates a person in God's sight. It's what comes out of the mouth that contaminates a person. These Pharisees, these experts in the law, were ones that said, okay, we're going to keep the law so that we look better than everybody else. We're going to keep the law so that everybody looks up to us. And essentially Jesus says, if you're keeping the law for those reasons, or merely to stay out of trouble, or to earn some kind of reward, you're doing it for the wrong reasons. The contaminants of your heart are coming out in those moments. But he said, if you're keeping the law because you fear, love, and trust in God above all things, and you have this relationship with God that you love and embrace, and you're keeping the law because of your love for God, then that's the right way of doing this. After Jesus is done with the Pharisees, he gets away. And he really gets away because he leaves Israel. He goes northwest up to the towns of Tyre and Sidon, in a territory that used to be in the Old Testament inhabited by the Canaanites. The Canaanites were the Israelites' enemies. They were a wicked people. They sacrificed children. They had prostitution. And they did all sorts of things that oppose the good and gracious will of God. And yet we still find a Canaanite in the midst of Jesus' family tree. As Jesus' family tree unfolds at the beginning of Matthew, Rahab is listed there. Rahab was a Canaanite. She was living in Jericho when some spies came, and she gave them safe harbor and said that she wanted to join them in following the God who was with them. And as James writes, he says, so you see that a person is shown to be righteous through faithful actions and not through faith alone. In the same way, wasn't Rahab the prostitute shown to be righteous when she received the messengers as her guests and then sent them on by another road? As the lifeless body is dead, so faith without actions is dead. God worked in, through, and on behalf of that Canaanite woman Rahab, and she ended up in Jesus' family tree. These cities of Tyre and Sidon are also near a town that was known as Zarephath. Again, outside of Israel. And yet one of Israel's greatest prophets, Elijah, went to Zarephath. And he provided a never-ending, unending supply of flour and oil for a widow. A widow who not only had lost her husband, but her son was lying upstairs dead as well. And Elijah went upstairs and he raised her son back to life again, giving her an even greater gift. It's interesting to see God work on the margins. And as we catch up with Jesus, he's headed to those margins. And with his Jewish Hebrew disciples following with him, they're probably a little anxious. They're probably a little scared. They're probably saying, wait a minute, Jesus, we're going to be with those people? They're unclean. Haven't you heard of what life is like there? It's pagan land. They're wicked. They're scum. They're ugh. But that's where Jesus goes, taking his disciples with him. And as Jesus enters there, all of a sudden he starts playing the role of the typical Jewish rabbi. There's this Canaanite woman who comes. Her daughter has a demon. And she is beside herself. She's crying out, calling out, wailing. And finally the disciples say, Jesus, send her away. She's bothering us. Ironically, it isn't the first time that we hear the disciples do that, isn't it? Back when the crowd of 5,000 men plus women and children were gathered, the disciples came to Jesus then and said, Jesus, send these people home, will you? We don't have to deal with them anymore. The disciples are a little slow at learning their lessons, just like you and me. And something else is interesting here. This woman's daughter has a demon. Jesus has already equipped his disciples. He's trained them in how to get rid of demons. They could minister to this woman. They could heal her daughter. And yet they're caught up with their own discomfort. They're caught up with their own discomfort in being in this pagan land and hearing this woman go on and on and on. As it continues, she says, show me mercy, son of David. My daughter is suffering terribly from demon possession. This Canaanite woman, as Matthew labels her, Mark calls her a Syro-phoenician woman, which is probably more accurate for the region. She uses a messianic title. She uses Jesus' divine name, the Son of David. She must have heard about Jesus. She must have known something was there. And so she's crying out, and yet Jesus continues to ignore her. He continues to turn away from her. And he says to his disciples, I've been only sent for the lost sheep of Israel. And by this point, she's kneeling in front of Jesus. Kneeling in a posture of worship. Continuing to cry out to Jesus. And he says, it is not good to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Yes, Jesus just called this woman and her daughter a little dog. Like a chihuahua. Not a compliment. Not a kind thing. That's why I said, the Jesus we encounter here, this is a different kind of Jesus. In Middle Eastern culture, well, this type of banter back and forth was part of their culture. And so maybe Jesus is just playing along with that. Maybe Jesus is playing a role, trying to see what the disciples will do. We really don't know. But it's a very unkind statement. And as he labels her a dog, well, it was an ethnic slur for non-Jewish people. Dogs were unclean. This woman is unclean because she's not an Israelite. This woman is unclean because she's a woman. So she's doubly unclean. And yet she's there, continuing to persevere. And so she pushes back on Jesus. And she says, yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall off their master's table. Maybe she had a pet at home. Greek culture had dogs as house pets. Hebrew culture did not. And maybe she was used to having a family meal and crumbs dropping and the dogs coming and cleaning up those crumbs. But she's willing to put herself in that space. And she's willing to continue to persevere because she knows that Jesus can heal her daughter. She believes he is the Son of David. She believes he's the chosen one who was sent from God. And she knows her daughter needs healing. And so she continues to persevere with hope that doesn't make any sense at all. And keep pushing on this Jewish rabbi. Jan Richardson wrote a poem about this text. And she writes of the woman, "I am saying you can close the door, but I will keep knocking. You can go silent, but I will keep shouting. You can tighten the circle, but I will trace a bigger one around you, around the life of my child, who will tell you, no one surpasses a mother for stubbornness." Be a good poem for Mother's Day. Yeah. Hallmark card right there. Yeah, maybe not. But this woman has a stubborn faith. She is not giving up. She is doing everything she can to get Jesus' attention. She's irritated his disciples. And yet she won't stop. She's persevering. Reminds me of a couple other women throughout our American history. Sojourner Truth was a slave, and she escaped slavery in 1826. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to take her son with her. So she somehow secured an attorney, and she fought in court for the next 2 years to have her son released from slavery and reunited with her care. Similarly, in 1955, on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks is sitting at the front of the bus, and, well, she was the wrong color. Kind of like this Canaanite woman, wrong skin color, wrong accent, wrong gender, wrong place. And as Rosa Parks is asked to move by a white person, she stays seated. And she does not move. Perseverance and grit. On the surface of everything for this Canaanite woman, this Syro-phoenician woman, this non-Israelite woman, she didn't deserve God's grace. At least that was the prevailing thought of the rules that the rabbis were following in those days. She was the wrong gender, had the wrong accent, the wrong skin color. She was beyond the boundaries. And yet at the end of the story, Jesus comes to her and he says, "Woman, you have great faith. It will be just as you wish." He doesn't call her a dog. Doesn't say Canaanite woman. Doesn't separate her by her ethnicity. He welcomes her and accepts her and meets her and heals her daughter. That's where God's grace goes. God's grace is here in this space. And yet God's grace goes beyond the boundaries of the congregation. God's grace goes to other places, to these places where there are folks that, well, maybe they feel that they're living beyond the reach of God's grace. And yet God can work faith in those spaces, as God works faith here among us. How can we emulate the tenacity, the perseverance, the grit of this woman's faith? How can we lean into the hope and the promises that we have in this book at those times when life and everything around us is telling us just give up? How can we do that? How can we persevere in this faith that has brought us here? And there's something else in this story. Every one of us was one of those people at one time. Every one of us was one of those people that many would say, well, we were beyond the grace of God, at least by what's in here. And yet God reached us. God took us in our uncleanness. God accepts us in our sin-soaked nature. In that nature that seeks to rebel and go the other way, God gets a hold of us. And he cleanses us in the waters of baptism. And he heals us. He gives us the Holy Spirit, and He continues to grow this faith inside of us. To grow this faith inside of us, to reach others with this same faith, especially those who are on the margins or might be in those categories of folks that make us a little uncomfortable. Sometimes God calls us to go beyond our comfort zone, to share and to live this faith that He has called us to. Amen. A couple questions for you to ponder. How great is your faith? How great is your faith? And how can God strengthen your faith? Things for you to think on.